Welcome back, everyone, to episode 3 of Revolutionary Roads, a podcast of the North Carolina History Project here at the John Locke Foundation. My name is Donald Bryson. I'm CEO of the John Locke Foundation, and I'm happy to be your host to walk you through North Carolina's incredibly rich history of its role in the American Revolution. Previously on this podcast, we've talked about the War of Regulation, which was sort of a revolution before the Revolution, a revolt against the colonial government or the royal governor at the time, William Tryon. That was in 1771. That led us into a conversation about the Edenton Tea Party, where 51 women of Edenton, North Carolina, stood in solidarity with the Patriots of Boston after the Boston Tea Party, and they signed their names and sent it to King George III. Now we've walked a little bit further into history. The Edenton Tea Party happened in October of 1774, and now we are coming into the spring of 1775, where we've had the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. The First Continental Congress meets from September to October of 1774. Then the battles of Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world, happens at the bridge there in Lexington. That happens on April 9th of 1775, and then that news spreads throughout the colonies, and that's where we are, and that's where our guest finds us today. Our guest today is a friend of the John Locke Foundation. We're happy to have him here. His name is Dan Gibson. He's a practicing attorney here in the Raleigh area. He's also an adjunct professor of law at Wake Forest University. Thanks for joining us today, Dan.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So you've sort of put yourself into the history of the Mecklenburg Declaration. You gave a lecture several months ago here at the John Locke Foundation on the anniversary of the Mecklenburg Declaration, which is May 20th, 1775. And, state flags are an interesting study. If you look at, the flag of South Carolina, you have a tree and a moon, which is kind of weird, right?
Feels Islamic. Almost.
Right. And then you have the Alabama state flag, which is St. Andrew's Cross. Then you have the Florida state flag, which looks similar to the Alabama flag, but that's not St. Andrew's Cross. It's the burgundy cross with the state seal on it. Uh-huh. And then, Virginia has their state seal on it.
Does it still say Sic Semper Tyrannis?
Still says Sic Semper Tyrannis. And then, I think Pennsylvania is basically a blue field with their state seal on it. Tennessee is a red field with a blue circle in the middle with 3 white stars.
Wyoming or Montana recently have theirs redesigned too.
Yeah, and I know Mississippi had theirs redesigned a while back as well.
They had the Confederate flag on there.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm surprised no one's come for Virginia. I don't mean that in a positive or negative
way,
but no. Sic Semper Tyrannis has some other connotations these days.
It does. When I hear Sic Semper Tyrannis, I think about John Wilkes Booth, which is what he screamed when he shot Lincoln.
Most people, it was Virginia's motto at the time.
Right.
But I don't think most people think of it as Virginia's motto today.
But I still think it could be a liberty-loving motto.
Yeah.
And that would be fine.
It's just a little on the nose these days still.
But North Carolina's flag is interesting because it looks a lot like the Texas state flag, except we have 2 dates on it. We have May 20th, 1775 and April 12th, 1776. May 20th, 1775 is a month and a day after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Can you kind of, what's going on in North Carolina?
Sure.
Where is this news spread of the battles of Lexington and Concord?
So the 2 dates on the flag, to sort of answer the first part of the question, you got the Mecklenburg Declaration and the Halifax Resolves.
Right.
And I think that's important to start with because North Carolina is very proud to say that we're first in freedom. Mm-hmm. And my argument is, regardless of how you feel about the Declaration being a real document, we were still first in freedom because the Halifax Resolves still beat everyone else to the punch.
That's right.
Now, Rhode Island will come along and say, well, you didn't clearly say independence, so we beat you because we said the word independence. But the Halifax Resolves were before Rhode Island,
right,
and clearly understood in that way. And whatever happened in Mecklenburg County has been understood in that way,
right,
was understood at the time in that way. I mean, you've got people calling it treasonous, including the governor. So you've talked about the regulator movement, so I won't sort of rehash that history. But you've got this sort of increasing drumbeat of, I'm going to use the word imperial power from the crown.
Okay.
So the British theory of government at the time, that the people running Parliament and the king have the idea that Parliament is completely sovereign and can therefore tax the American colonies. They, in fact, pass an act called the Act of Supremacy, I think in 73 or 74, saying basically we can do whatever we want to you colonies. And that's on top of the Tea Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, all of that.
And this is when we start hearing the very famous phrase, no taxation without representation, because the members of Parliament are from England.
Yeah.
Just England, not the broader Commonwealth of Great Britain. They're from England.
So they have this theory of virtual representation, which is to say that your representative in Parliament, whoever the landowner is, like the Shaftesbury Society, Lord Shaftesbury, I believe was involved in the colonial land holdings in North Carolina. I should have reviewed my North Carolina history.
Sure.
So Lord Shaftesbury, well, he owns a ton of land in North Carolina, so he's going to represent you in England, even though he's never been here. So don't you feel represented?
Yeah, if you'll notice, Dan's got a nice lapel pin, which you also can have one, of the John Locke Foundation. That is John Locke. We're a classically liberal organization. That's our leaning here at the John Locke Foundation. But he also wrote the foundational constitution of the colony of Carolina when it was North and South Carolina were one colony. The Earl of Shaftesbury, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper, was one of the Lords Proprietors of the colony of Carolina and had John Locke write that constitution, which is actually a really terrible political document. It sets up a landed gentry and all this other stuff. But if you go to Charleston, South Carolina today, it's at the mouths of the Ashley River and the Cooper River, named after Anthony Ashley Cooper, obviously. So that is our rooted history into North Carolina. But go on.
He was
a great
certainly
aside.
I would say a more liberal, a more enlightened lord than many of the other lords.
Yeah, liberal with the root word being to liberate.
Yes.
Right? Not in the way that we use it now in
Liberal
American.
in the Lockean sense of the word.
That's right. The correct sense.
As opposed to someone that's dictatorial.
Right.
So this is a problem, not just in theory, but also in practice. So specifically in Mecklenburg County, in 1766, a guy named George Selwyn, who is a large landowner in Mecklenburg County, but he's an absentee landowner. He lives in England, and he's just collecting rent from this land grant that he has in Mecklenburg County.
Sure.
Well, he wants to figure out what land he owns, and he wants to get rent for the land that he owns. So he sends a surveyor. People of Mecklenburg County don't like this idea. They seize the surveyor and try to stop him. So this is sort of the first hint that there's going to be some serious problems in Mecklenburg County.
Yeah.
Even legally, just put my lawyer hat on for a second. In America, we have this doctrine called adverse possession.
Okay.
So basically, if you live in New York and you own land in South Dakota and you're not out there often enough to know whether or not anybody's using it, if someone uses it, puts up a fence, starts using it, and uses it for the right amount of time, it actually legally becomes their land.
Oh.
So that was obviously not happening in the colonies at the time. So you've got all of this sort of conflict, both regionally and nationally to the extent that we had a nation at the time. And the thing that I think there's the Lexington and Concord spark that you've already identified.
Right.
But there's an additional spark just generally in North Carolina, which is that on April 8th, 1775, Governor Martin dissolves the North Carolina legislature.
Right. So the representation they actually did have has been dissolved.
Gone. And there's been a historic argument about what their legislature actually can do. This is, we'll get to this more later, but North Carolina has historically been very skeptical of governors for that reason. We've got a bad history with executives.
And God bless North Carolina.
So yeah, you've got all these problems leading up to it. And I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind as we go more into the Declaration is Continental Congress is meeting in 1775.
Right.
And they're still meeting after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And after the battles of Lexington and Concord, they send this document to the king called the Olive Branch Petition,
Right.
basically saying, please, we'd like to work this out.
Written by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah, who was staunchly opposed to independence. So even after Lexington and Concord, it's more than a year after Lexington and Concord before we declare our independence. We're being shot at, and we're still trying to work things out.
Right.
It's surprising, I think, to most people just how long. The Boston Massacre was in 1770.
Right.
We're 5-6 years later for our independence.
The Boston Massacre was before the Battle of Alamance.
Yeah.
So we're bubbling for years at this point.
So, and really the things going on in North Carolina should probably have been a warning flag to the king and to Parliament, because, and we'll talk about this more later too, I think the concept in Parliament and for Lord North, Lord Bute, the parliamentary leaders, was this is just some disaffected people in New England. Sam Adams, John Adams, just a bunch of crazy people, and some of them are even related, and it's not really representative of the people of the United States. Most people in the United States are actually, or the colonies,
or the American colonies,
are actually loyal to the crown.
Right.
But you've got this massive counter to that happening in the Carolinas at the time.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. So Martin dissolves Parliament. The shots being fired in Massachusetts.
Yep.
And there's already pushback in Mecklenburg County, what you pointed to in terms of surveying property and paying rent to lords and landholders in England. And it's interesting. We were talking beforehand a little bit about when did Charlotte become Charlotte, and you had mentioned Mecklenburg County, and just I imagine if you're listening to this podcast, and by the way, if you like what you've heard so far over the first 2 episodes and on this episode as well, please like, subscribe, pass it along to your friends, and so you can continue to be with us on our walk through North Carolina history. But King George III marries Queen Charlotte. His queen consort is Queen Charlotte, and so that's where we get the name Charlotte. But she is from, we'd like to think of Germany now as one whole nation. If you were during the Cold War, you think of it as East Germany and West Germany, but in the 1700s up well into the 1800s, Germany was really just a broken mass of different states, and she is from the Principality of Mecklenburg, and that's where we get the name Mecklenburg County, and whose county seat is Charlotte, and that's where we find ourselves in this situation as we get into May of 1775.
So on May 19th, 1775, Colonel Polk organizes a county meeting in Mecklenburg County. The parliament's been dissolved, or the legislature's been dissolved in North Carolina, where we're trying to figure out how we're going to respond. And at that time, they don't know about Lexington and Concord. So they're meeting to try to figure out what do we need to do next. The quote is they're trying to devise ways and means to extricate themselves and ward off the impending storm bursting upon them by the British nation. Now, this meeting is providentially timed.
Okay.
So they start meeting, and then the same day that they're meeting, news of Lexington and Concord arrives.
Wow.
So you've got a bunch of people that are already decided to do something. And one eyewitness says, "We smelt and felt the blood and carnage of Lexington, which raised all our passions into fury and revenged." And so they decide to do something. The question is, what is the something that they decide to do? We'll deal with that a little bit more.
Sure.
But one eyewitness at the time says they declared themselves absolved from their allegiance to the King of Great Britain and drew up a Declaration of Independence, which was unanimously adopted. The next day, they read that declaration on the courthouse steps in Mecklenburg County. People are cheering, throwing their hats off. And then they give it to Captain James Jack, a cavalry officer at the time, to send to Philadelphia to give to North Carolina's representatives to the Continental Congress.
Okay.
There's a really fun story here that may or may not be apocryphal. James Jack says it's what happened.
Okay.
He stops off at the courthouse in Salisbury in Rowan County and gives a copy to one of the attorneys who's practicing in court that day, and he reads it aloud to the court.
Okay.
And some of the attorneys in court did not like it and considered it a treasonous document, tried to stop him. So he pulls his pistols and gets his way. I don't think he ended up firing his way out of the courthouse, but he says,
he works his way out.
You're not taking me alive. He ends up getting it all the way up to Philadelphia. I don't think he stopped by other courthouses on the way for some reason.
I wouldn't.
But the delegates say that they didn't think Congress was prepared to act on as important a measure as independence. And that's why I said earlier that we need to keep in mind that independence is still more than a year off nationally. They're still actively debating this proposition. So this is the great story of the Mecklenburg Declaration. And then John McNitt Alexander, who was one of the folks involved in writing the document, allegedly keeps a copy of the document.
Okay.
It's kept in his house. It's lost in a house fire. It burns down in 1800. And then his son, by his own words, says that he recreated it. It might not be an exact, it's maybe not exactly what we said at the time, but it's my best recollection based on his notes and so on and so forth.
Right.
And that's then published in the Raleigh Register in 1819.
Interesting.
So
all right.
When it's published in the Raleigh Register, John Adams gets a copy of it and sends it to his friend Thomas Jefferson,
who've made up at this point.
Yeah. I think they were in one of their on again, off again. They were on in that part of their relationship. Adams seems to think it's real. Jefferson does not think that it's real.
Okay.
So they have sort of the back and forth, and Jefferson is sort of the father of a lot of the arguments against the Mecklenburg Declaration. Well, if it was real, why wasn't it published at the time? Why didn't anybody say anything?
Right.
So on and so forth.
Right.
Which is a credible argument.
That's interesting. So you've told the traditional story of the Mecklenburg Declaration, and there are people using the Jeffersonian arguments, and people have written books and many articles about this. What are the arguments that it's not real?
Jefferson's argument is probably the best argument.
Okay.
Why don't you have an original? Why don't you have any other copy?
Right.
Why didn't anybody talk about it at the time? If Mecklenburg County did actually declare independence, surely someone somewhere would have
wrote it down or has a copy. And even of the American Declaration of Independence, they're all the broadsides.
A lot of copies. Right. Yeah. It got published pretty quickly.
Right.
So that's kind of the established argument against it.
Right.
There's no real contemporaneous records. Something was published in the Mercury, a newspaper in Cape Fear, I think maybe out of New Bern, if I'm remembering correctly. But we don't have the copy of that document.
Okay.
Allegedly, so that they sent an American ambassador to England in the 1830s to try to investigate this. And he went to the records of this newspaper and allegedly only found the Mecklenburg Resolves. Now, the reason why I say allegedly is we still don't have it. And there is some allegation on the other side of this that he was actually a friend of Thomas Jefferson. And he's the one that removed the records.
Sure.
Because, Thomas Jefferson wants to... If Thomas Jefferson plagiarized the Mecklenburg Declaration, which if it was legit, I think there'd be a good argument that he did plagiarize it, then, well, he might have an interest in trying to cover that up.
Okay. That's interesting. So May 20th, 1775 is the date on the North Carolina flag, and that is the date of the Mecklenburg Declaration. But there's another document that appears 11 days later on May 31st, 1775, called the Mecklenburg Resolves. Can you compare and contrast these two documents?
I would say that the best way to understand the two of those would be the Mecklenburg Declaration is like the Declaration of Independence, and the Mecklenburg Resolves are more like the Articles of Confederation or the United States Constitution.
Okay.
So the United States Constitution has some good language in the preamble, not to insult the other language in the Constitution. But the Constitution's much more concerned about laying out an actual form of government. Now that we're a nation, this is how we're going to govern ourselves.
Right.
The Declaration of Independence isn't concerned with the particulars of, are we going to have a president? Are we going to have a bicameral legislature? This, that, and the other thing. These are our foundational principles, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, the language that we all know. And then here's all the reasons why we're declaring independence. It's basically an indictment against the British government at the time.
Right.
So it's a lot more powerful in its language. The Mecklenburg Declaration, same thing. It's saying we're declaring ourselves independent, but then the question becomes, okay, if you're independent, you're going to have some form of government.
Sure.
You know, the founding fathers were pretty afraid of anarchy.
Right. They were very afraid of John Adams in particular.
Yeah, we need a document that governs us, and that
Right.
would be the Mecklenburg Resolves.
Right.
That's again probably the pro-declaration argument, assuming that they're both legitimate documents. You've got one that says we're independent, and then another that says now that we're independent, this is how we're going to govern ourselves.
Right.
The anti-argument would be the Mecklenburg Resolves are the only real thing.
Right. And nobody really questions whether the resolves are real or not.
There's no historical argument. I think we have at least printed publications contemporaneous with the Mecklenburg Resolves.
Right.
There was some question, I think, early in America's history whether the Resolves were legitimate, but that is buried at this point.
But it is fair to say with the way you framed this, it is probably fair to say whether or not there are original copies of the Mecklenburg Declaration, the Mecklenburg Resolves, which were approved, voted on, published, whatever we want to say, if they were approved, who they're approved by, right? But they came up 11 days later, but the Mecklenburg Resolves assume independence, right?
That's how I read them. Now, there's an argument that the Rhode Island argument, as I'm going to term it. Well, you didn't formally say independence.
Right.
I think the evidence at the time clearly indicates that they did something significant.
Right.
And the best evidence of that is Governor Josiah Martin saying at the time that they published a treasonous and slanderous publication.
Right.
So to call it treason, well, what is treason?
Right.
It's rebelling against the authority of the crown.
And it's not just sedition, right? They're not just complaining.
No,
it's treason.
And bear in mind that's sort of what happened with the regulator movement. Is it started out as, I'm sure you've probably talked about this, a movement to rid the colonial government of corruption. And when they realized that was maybe not on the table, they got more radicalized.
Right.
So by the time of 1775 in Mecklenburg County, we've already got a pretty radicalized group.
Right.
That's, I think, ready to sort of take off the gloves and really have it out.
Right.
I'll look for that specific quote. Traitously declaring the entire dissolution of the laws, government, and constitution of this country. That's the specific wording that Governor Martin used August 8th, 1775. So something happened.
Right.
This argument that we didn't really clearly declare our own independence, I don't know how else you read the entire dissolution of the laws, government, and constitution of this country. If there was a quote in the New York Times that said Donald Trump entirely dissolved the laws, government, and constitution of this country, I think we would all understand what that meant.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that to say that's something Donald Trump would or would not do. I just mean if this were in any other context and we read that quote, we'd say that's the end of the government.
Right.
You have created a new nation at that point.
Yeah. No, that's what it sounds like.
My favorite little historical tidbit here. So the resolves are exactly 11 days after the Declaration.
We're going to talk about calendars, aren't we?
We are going to talk about
Let's
calendars. This is so nerdy. John Hood and I had a fun time talking about this
Sure.
too. You know John.
Yeah, and we'll have John at a later episode where he's going to talk about the history of the backcountry during the Revolution.
All right, I'll keep it very short.
All right.
The Gregorian calendar adds 11 days to the Julian calendar. Basically, we had a problem with the Julian calendar. I won't get into all of the details about calendars, but the years were not quite working out how they should work out.
Right.
So we added 11 days to the calendar to sort of fix that, plus leap days. The Gregorian calendar was adopted in the United Kingdom in 1754. But those changes didn't necessarily filter out to the colonies, especially a relatively backwoods colony like Mecklenburg County.
Charlotte was not the banking center that it is now.
No. So there's a possibility that they may not have adopted the Gregorian calendar. They might have still been using the Julian calendar, which would add 11 days. If you add 11 days to May 20th, you get May 31st, the date of the Mecklenburg Resolves. That seems just so coincidental to me that it suggests some sort of relationship.
Yeah, it makes me wonder... and I want to talk about sort of the content of the Mecklenburg Declaration in just a minute, but it makes me wonder if we aren't arguing over the same document.
It's entirely possible.
If the Mecklenburg Declaration and the Mecklenburg Resolves aren't just the same document. But there's no real way to prove that at this point. There are plenty of people who will argue that they both absolutely existed and they both are separate documents. But you talked a little bit about how Thomas Jefferson, some claim that Thomas Jefferson may have borrowed ideas or language from the Mecklenburg Declaration. Can you flesh that out? What does that mean? What does the Declaration say?
So it starts out by talking about unchartered and dangerous invasion of our rights as claimed by Great Britain, and declaring anyone that supports that an enemy of the country and to the inherent and inalienable rights of man. So you've got two things going on here. Unchartered is a word that we might not necessarily recognize today. If you wanted to have today's parlance of that, you would say unconstitutional. So Britain has been acting unconstitutionally.
Right.
And it's not just that they're violating positive law, it's that they're violating natural law, the inherent and inalienable rights of man. Now, we've got some people today who don't think that there are inherent and inalienable rights of man, including some senators in the United States Congress, unfortunately.
From Tim Kaine and his recent comments.
If you agree with John Locke and you agree with Thomas Jefferson, you think that there are inherent and inalienable rights of man. And John Locke's famous foundation of that was life, liberty, and property. Jefferson modifies that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Separate conversation to have. But the idea that we have inherent and inalienable rights, you can see how that would translated into sort of higher, more beautiful rhetoric by Thomas Jefferson would become we have unalienable rights.
Right. And that idea didn't just die with Jefferson. It's not like he wrote it in the Declaration of Independence and then we didn't apply it into American law. That's why the Ninth Amendment exists, which says essentially the purpose of the Ninth Amendment is just because we put out rights in the first 8 amendments to the U.S. Constitution in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean that there aren't other rights that people don't just have naturally.
Exactly.
And so don't think that this is the end of all rights that people have.
And bear in mind that even in the Bill of Rights, which North Carolina contributed to us having as a country, it's not saying we are giving people these rights. The Second Amendment, for some reason, has been discussed a lot recently. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's not saying our government is giving you this right. It's recognizing a right that already exists.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. We'll get into this later on. For episode 10 of this podcast, we've got Chief Justice Paul Newby scheduled to come in and talk about North Carolina ratifying the U.S. Constitution. And we'll talk about that controversy. But James Iredell County, there are a lot of county and town names when you get into this part of history. He argued at the Hillsborough Convention when they were arguing over the U.S. Constitution that we shouldn't have a Bill of Rights because codifying a list of rights may make people think that only those rights written down exist. And he thought that was dangerous. And so this is a very Lockean thought process that's sort seeping out of everybody in North Carolina, or the political leaders, the patriotic political leaders in North Carolina at this time.
So the Declaration goes on to say that they're dissolving the political bands which have connected us to the mother country. We absolve ourselves from all allegiance to the British crown, abjure all political connections because they have wantonly trampled our rights and our liberties and inhumanely shed the innocent American blood of patriots at Lexington. They declare themselves a free and independent people and are and of right ought to be a sovereign and self-governing association under control of no power other than that of our God and the general government of Congress. We pledge each other our mutual cooperation, our lives, our fortunes, our most sacred honor. This should be sounding familiar.
It sounds very familiar.
And we acknowledge the existence and control of no law or legal officer, civil or military, within this country. And we adopt each and every of our former laws unless they're sort of inconsistent with our independence. And then they do a little bit about the military matters at the end. What's really interesting and may have upset Thomas Jefferson is when John Adams sent it to him. He says, if this is legitimate, what a poor, ignorant, malicious, short-sighted, crapulous mass is Thomas Paine's common sense in comparison with this paper. And sort of by implication, isn't this a little bit better than what we wrote? Bear in mind, when I say we there, Adams was originally appointed to write the Declaration of Independence. He was just too busy, and he thought that it needed to come from a Virginian because Virginia was the most populous state at the time, and kind of had a lot of the revolutionary leaders. Many of our early presidents were Virginians.
Right.
So he handed it off to this young Virginian that was relatively unknown at the time, Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin wrote the Declaration. Jefferson, the primary author, Adams and Franklin were the editors.
Right. It's an interesting crowd, the three of those. And you've got Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia, three very important states to the Revolution represented there, of course. While Franklin was all for independence, his personality did not lend him to be the one to stick his neck out.
No.
And so they got the young redhead from Virginia to do the writing. And it's that language is awfully similar. Where do you fall on the debate? Meckdeck, real myth?
The thing that I think is the most convincing to me is the governor's statement at the time.
Yeah.
And then also one that I haven't mentioned, Thomas Bagg, a Moravian in Forsyth County, Winston-Salem. In 1783, in his journal, he writes, "In May, June, or July, the county of Mecklenburg, North Carolina, declared itself free and independent of England."
Oh, okay.
So we've got, again, people at the time that don't seem to have any real stake. If anything, they have a stake against it, like Josiah Martin, saying this is what happened.
Yeah.
I think there was some document preceding the Mecklenburg Resolves.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's exactly what we've got here.
Right. Because this was reproduced in 1819.
And acknowledged at the time as this might not be like a verbatim accurate copy by the guy who gave this to the Raleigh Register. When we talk about this sounding similar to the Declaration of Independence, I don't think that's necessarily a fundamental problem for this document because the Declaration of Independence, I think they still have this in Philadelphia. If you go up there, you can see all of the places that Thomas Jefferson is getting these ideas from. He was not coming up with something novel.
Right.
John Locke is all over the place, but it's not just John Locke. I mean, there's Montesquieu, there's a lot of other philosophers coming into this.
Right.
So the idea that there might be similar language, like inherent and inalienable rights.
Right.
I mean, that was in the water that they were swimming in at the time. So I think something undoubtedly happened.
So there are two separate intellectual questions, right? The first question is, was there a document that preceded the Mecklenburg Resolves? And the second question is the document that was given to the Raleigh Register accurate enough to be reflected as that document?
I really don't know whether or not this document is accurate enough. I'd love it to be accurate enough, but I think there's too many questions.
Right.
The thing that I care the most about is I think the people of Mecklenburg County in May of 1775 declared themselves free and independent.
Right. And that's the more important question.
Doing that. Yeah.
Right.
Whether it was the resolves by implication or a separate declaration, I think there was a separate document.
Right.
Because I don't think the resolves go far enough in the independence direction to say, yes, we're clearly declaring independence. But that's obviously how they were understood at the time.
Yeah.
I can't get away from Josiah Martin's statement in August of 1775.
Sure, it's hard to beat.
He seems like he would be the guy that would know what's going on in his own colony at the time. Right. I guess maybe you could read it and say he's overstating. He seems like the most credible witness in all of this.
Yeah, no,
to put my lawyer hat back on.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I want to talk more about Josiah Martin a little bit as we talk about the aftermath of Meckdeck. But I think, for the 13 original states, the communities that were involved in these acts of revolution and these acts of independence that led to American freedom, they're very proud of that. It's Philadelphia is going to explode next year,
Yeah.
right? That's aside from what's going to happen in the nation's capital. Boston has a very proud heritage, but then we've also seen great celebrations in Edenton, North Carolina, with Edenton Resolves. Talk about sort of the importance and the celebration that happens on May 20th down in Charlotte, if you don't mind.
We have been celebrating Mecklenburg Declaration from 1801 until today. And we've had presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Dwight Eisenhower, Gerald Ford have all come to Charlotte.
Really? Wow.
The most interesting address that I found in all of this, the one that I liked the most, was Billy Graham.
Okay.
I did not realize that Billy Graham came and talked about the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence.
All right.
And sort of connected it in with what we today might call civic virtue. But the idea that, this is the Lockean understanding of liberty is coming from God. But also a free and independent, a self-governing people is not just we're going to organize a form of government to govern ourselves, but we are also going to govern ourselves individually. There's a famous toast from 1801 from Lafayette. The citizens of Mecklenburg being the first in their Declaration of Independence, may they ever be first in resisting usurpation by defending their civil rights. And I think it again goes to show the sort of people that we had in North Carolina at the time. And there's a larger history here of, like we talked about with the Bill of Rights.
Right.
Another significant thing for our state and our state constitution, we were, I would say, the first state to come up with the idea of judicial review.
Okay.
Bayard versus Singleton, one of the most important North Carolina Supreme Court cases. I think Virginia or Massachusetts, someone likes to try to argue that they beat us because Bayard didn't actually technically declare a law unconstitutional, but it recognized that the court had the authority to say if a law violates the Constitution, we can strike it down.
Yeah.
Now, that was a wild break from British tradition. In the United Kingdom, still to this day,
Sure.
I like to call it the Richard Nixon rules. If the Parliament does it, it is not illegal.
Right.
So there's no judicial review. Whatever Parliament does is constitutional.
Right.
So, and that flows from the idea that we have in the Declaration of Independence and the Mecklenburg Declaration, that we have inalienable, inherent rights from God.
Right.
And our form of government goes down that way. So the government only has the authority, especially at the federal level, to do the things that we constitutionally allow them to do.
Right.
We are a limited government. North Carolina is a little bit different. Justice Newby can talk to you more about this.
It's a different bear. Right.
But our Constitution imposes affirmative limits on the authority of the General Assembly, the governor, even our judges.
Well, we didn't even give the governor veto power in North Carolina until 1996.
Yeah.
We have people like to talk about co-equal branches of government, and that might be true at the federal level, but it is
absolutely
not true in North Carolina.
The North Carolina constitutional law is very clear on this point that the General Assembly is really supreme.
They are separate. They are not equal.
I would even take issue with the idea of the governor being considered the executive in North Carolina.
Because we have a dispersed executive.
Council of State, yes.
That's right.
Now, I think our Constitution doesn't give you room for the argument that the governor is not the executive anymore.
Right.
If it were me as well, I'd probably take the governor's veto power away too. I'd give it to the Council of State.
Okay. That would be interesting.
I think that's historically been consistent with our practice as a state.
Yeah.
And with the Council of State, you've got a pretty educated, diverse group.
Yeah.
Anyone that wants to complain about gerrymandering, the Council of State ends up being generally roughly representative, Republican and Democrat.
And they're statewide elections, right?
I guess that would be giving Steve Troxler, 1/8 of a vote on vetoing, probably for the foreseeable future.
Man, that'd be interesting to just see happen.
Yeah.
Let's do this for a year and just see what happens.
It would be really interesting. But North Carolina has historically been very skeptical of the executive, very pro-legislative.
Right.
And I think that's rooted in this history.
Yeah.
it's not just that we had Tryon's palace and Governor Martin dissolving the legislature.
Right.
It's also that we had legislative movements historically that were key to our independence. You know, Halifax Resolves as well, out of a legislative body.
Yeah.
So that I think, to me, that's the most significant part of all of this, is that North Carolina has stood up and had its legislature say, no, you can only go so far.
Right.
We're going to limit your rights or your power. And when you cross these constitutional lines, we're going to stop you.
Yeah.
Something that is, I would say, still relevant today.
Yeah.
You know, when you've got an executive, and I don't mean this necessarily about today's executive, but when you've got an executive imposing taxes, sending troops, denying jury trials, these are all the charges in the document, the Declaration of Independence.
Right. And this has happened more and more as federal executive power has expanded over the past quarter century.
On behalf of Skip Stam, one of your board members, my former law partner, I'd have to say, you know, if you can come back as far as 1215, Magna Carta, and look at what happens when executive power expands. The whole point of Magna Carta was the king was saying, I can levy taxes to raise an army, to do what I want to do, and I don't have to ask the Lord's permission before I start raising taxes.
Right.
And we said, no, you can't do that. You have to get our consent to tax. That is the very origin of Parliament, is the idea that the king can't tax his people without their consent.
That's right.
And we're carrying that idea through. And the sort of executive overreach that you see, I mean, it's not anything new. It goes back to King John, arguably before King John.
Right.
So the ways that people try to expand their power, you know, it's those things that are in the Bill of Rights, those things that are in the Declaration of Independence, we're doing the same thing today.
And then you have John Locke comes along in the late 1600s. He dies in 1704, but he does his major work around 1689, 1690. Yeah. And he writes a lot about a separation of powers. And we think that separation of powers is an American invention, and it's not. It's straight out of John Locke. And he talks about how the branches of government should be separate and the power should be separate, and there are really good reasons for that, which you've just described. And then he comes to, but if the government keeps acting in a way which is illegal and the people can get no redress, then the people have a right to revolt.
Yep.
And that's it. And it's in that section, the people's right to revolt, where we get the term appeal to heaven.
Yes.
Because all they can do is appeal to heaven, which is put it in God's hands and fight for it. And that's what these people are doing. They're literally living out sort of this Lockean philosophy.
And that brings us back to North Carolina, Mecklenburg County. 20 years before the Mecklenburg Resolves, a Presbyterian minister, Reverend Craighead, was preaching resistance to tyranny. And he was basing that on the famous Scottish theologian John Knox, sort of the founding father of Scottish Presbyterianism, who said, if princes exceed their bounds, they may be resisted by force.
Yeah.
So this isn't just a secular idea. It's also one that is grounded in particular religious beliefs as well. Now, you don't have to share those religious beliefs to agree with John Locke.
Right.
Locke makes it very clear he's reasoning from first principles.
Right.
Christian or no, you can agree with John Locke.
Right.
But I say that to say, you know, there were a lot of Scots-Irish in Mecklenburg County in North Carolina at the time. And there were also religious debates going on. You know, among other things, you had to be married by an ordained minister to be legally married.
Right.
Now, a properly ordained minister in the United Kingdom at that time was Anglican.
Right.
If you're Scots-Irish and you're Presbyterian, you don't like having to go find someone from a different church, a church that you think is illegitimate, possibly heretical, to come do your marriage.
I mean, there was a time in North Carolina where if you believed in transubstantiation, you couldn't be married, which any Catholic wedding that was going to happen couldn't happen. They would have been wedding marriages outside of the law. Boy, we really birdwalked on that one, didn't we?
We did really. But I think the point at the end of the day of all of this is, you know, when we're declaring our independence and we're saying you can only go so far. I think judicial review, federalism, limited government, these are the things that the United States really came up with. That's what's unique. You can find, if you haven't read them, you should read Edmund Burke's contemporary speeches at the time. Speech on Conciliation with the Colonies is fantastic.
And I think a lot of people think of Edmund Burke as just this political philosopher in England, but he was a member of Parliament actively during this time period, right?
So his whole argument to Parliament is you shouldn't do this to the colonies because you're undermining your own constitutional rights.
Right.
You are sawing off the limb that you are sitting on.
Right.
It's a powerful argument, but the Americans, I think, carry that even further. We say at the federal level, you only have the powers that we give you, and we're reserving the rest to the people in the states. And when you transcend those powers, the courts will check you and stop you from doing that. So we have multiple checks on the federal government. We don't just have courts, we also have states.
Right.
And that is not something that's previously been really practiced in any other government.
Yeah, we say United States of America, and it sort of rolls off the tongue as a nation, but we are only the United States of America because the states have, in fact, decided to unite. And from there is where the federal government is created. It's not that the federal government existed and we had this 3,000 miles of continent that we could split up into 50 states. No, it happened the other way.
Yeah.
People forget that for whatever reason. Can we talk a little bit about you've talked about Josiah Martin and Governor Martin, and he dissolves the state's assembly, and then the Mecklenburg Declaration and the Mecklenburg Resolves happen. Talk a little bit about what happens with Governor Martin after this.
I mean, he's still governor, but there's not really very much to govern at the time. As North Carolina is moving further and further towards independence, the colonial government was already tenuous, I would say, west of Raleigh. Arguably west of Edenton and New Bern, it was tenuous. Even in Edenton and New Bern, it's a little bit tenuous. But I think one of the ideas that Britain had in terms of we're going to nip this thing in the bud is these are just, like I said earlier, some rabble here and there, and we can sort of impose our will and impose our force. And I talked about Scots-Irish being opposed to the crown. There were a lot of Scots-Irish that were pro-crown. Yeah. You've got two battles in North Carolina, Moores Creek Bridge and Kings Mountain. Kings Mountain's kind of on the North Carolina-South Carolina border. Right. That are largely North Carolinians fighting themselves. Right.
A lot of people call the American Revolution America's first Civil War.
I think there's a good argument that it was. And I think it's really kind of a continuation of the English Civil War when you had Oliver Cromwell and, Tories versus people who were pro-Parliament. Right. And that's where the idea of no taxation without representation, that rallying cry came from the 1620s. The idea that King Charles doesn't have unlimited authority. Right. So we've been saying, no, there's a limit on authority for a very, very long time here. Right. So, Martin, if I'm not mistaken, he stays governor until the end of the war. But the Carolinas colonies, South Carolina more so than North Carolina, is actually more easily governed by and large. Right. But North Carolina is a bigger state. It's a lot more rural. And projecting force there is remarkably difficult.
Right. No, that's absolutely the case. The Mecklenburg Declaration and Resolves happen. And not necessarily directly caused, but definitely sped up by those documents. Martin's government collapses. Not only does he not have the assembly that he's dissolved, but he also doesn't really have control of the executive branch anymore. And so he goes from New Bern, where the capital is, where Tryon's palace is, right? And he escapes down to what is Southport. And we'll hear more about this in the next episode, but he has to govern basically from the rest of the war from the HMS Cruiser, which is a British frigate moored in the Cape Fear River. It's right next to Fort Johnston, but Fort Johnston gets burned
I didn't know that.
very early on. So he's trying to govern and cobble together a government when unsuccessfully for the rest of the war from a ship.
Yeah.
And that's not really a great place to put a government together. But it was definitely precipitated by these documents that we're discussing here today. This has been a very enlightening conversation. I think it's been great talking about first principles, the myth, legend, story, whatever happened in Mecklenburg County. I agree with you. I think a document, whether it's the one that came out in 1819 or not, the people of Mecklenburg County did something before the Mecklenburg Resolves indicating that they believe themselves to be independent of Great Britain. And I think it's a great and important history to continue to celebrate. I imagine the May 20th Society and all the people in Charlotte will continue to celebrate that for a long time. But Dan, I really appreciate your time here today. It's been a great conversation.
Great. Thank you.
And if people want to take a look at more of this history, they can go to the North Carolina History Project online. If you're interested in more history of North Carolina and want to talk about the history of the Revolution, like and subscribe so you continue to get episodes of what's going on. Look at our previous episodes. But we look forward to continuing down the road of North Carolina in the American Revolution.